Charleston, South Carolina. October 2014. In a small coastal town, everyone knew her as Miss Ellie, Allison Mays, an English teacher, mother of 3, volunteer at a local shelter, and organizer of the school theater. To everyone, she was the ideal. In her 15 years of teaching at Jefferson High, she had become something more than just an educator. She was a symbol. People wrote about her in the newspapers. Children gave her handwritten letters. Parents thanked her for changing their children's lives, but teenagers know how to doubt, especially when someone seems too perfect. 16-year-old Jake Kelly felt the same. He didn't believe in saints. His younger sister had told him strange things about Miss Ellie's class. Little things, uncomfortable looks, subtle gestures, words that no one wanted to hear. So Jake made a decision. He hid a small camera inside a folder and left it on the back desk. The angle wasn't perfect, but it captured the teacher's desk, part of the board, and the moment no one was supposed to see. He didn't expect much, but the footage recorded on a Thursday afternoon went viral 2 days later. Because it didn't just change how people saw Miss Ellie, it changed everything. Jefferson High had always been the kind of school that looked better on paper than it did in person. The building itself was a patchwork of old bricks, half-painted walls, and dusty trophy cases filled with accomplishments from a different era. Still, to the community of Charleston, South Carolina, it was a symbol of stability, a fixture nestled between a decaying post office and a thrift store that hadn't changed its display window in 6 years. The school served working-class families, retirees raising grandchildren and single parents juggling 3 jobs, all of whom saw the school as more than a place for lectures and report cards. It was, in many ways, the heart of a neighborhood barely hanging on. And at the very center of that heart, there was one name everyone knew: Miss Allison Mays. She had been teaching English in room 214 for 15 years. Students came and went. Textbooks changed, computers replaced chalkboards, but Miss Mays remained constant. Her classroom was known for its warmth, both literal and emotional. While other teachers struggled with disengaged students and low morale, she kept her room decorated with student artwork, inspirational quotes scrawled in elegant handwriting across the whiteboard, and books stacked in neat piles on every flat surface. The windows were usually open, letting in the humid southern air, and the scent of cinnamon from a subtle diffuser hidden near her desk filled the room. She made eye contact when she spoke, remembered birthdays, and told every student, at least once, that they mattered. To parents, she was a godsend. She stayed after school to help kids with essays, offered rides to those who missed the bus, and never let a missed assignment define a student. She was a fixture at PTA meetings, organized charity drives, and once, during a hurricane season, opened her home to a displaced family. Local newspapers ran profiles about her, the woman who writes hope into every sentence. And the school superintendent often cited her classroom as an example of what education should look like. Parents bragged if their children were in her class, certain that she would inspire them to read more, write better, and become something bigger. To students, she was something between a mentor and a myth. They spoke about her in hushed tones, not out of fear but reverence. She had a way of making even the quietest kids feel seen. If someone forgot their lunch, she'd have snacks tucked in a drawer. If someone looked tired, she'd offer tea instead of judgment. Her grading was firm but fair, and when students walked into her classroom, they felt like they were stepping into a different world, one that was kinder, slower, and a little more forgiving. Even her discipline was gentle. She never yelled, never embarrassed anyone, never made a scene. Her words carried weight without raising volume. "I'm disappointed" from Miss Mays was more effective than detention from anyone else. Room 214 reflected her presence. The lighting was soft, never harsh. The desks were arranged in a loose semicircle that encouraged eye contact and connection. At the back of the room was a bulletin board covered in handwritten notes. Thank yous, college acceptance letters, photos of graduates who had gone on to places far from Charleston. Above her desk hung a framed poem, one she had written herself, about the power of stories to heal. The students rarely read it, but they knew it was important, just from the way she looked at it sometimes, And yet, beneath all this perfection, there was something else. Something harder to name. A sense that the room was too perfect, that the praise was too unanimous, that the lines between admiration and dependence had blurred. No one said anything aloud, of course. Who would? When someone is placed so high, on a pedestal, it becomes nearly impossible to question them. To doubt them is to threaten the very comfort they've provided. So instead, people leaned into the narrative. Miss Mays wasn't just a good teacher, she was untouchable, sacred. This wasn't by accident. Over the years, Allison had cultivated more than a reputation. She had curated an identity. She volunteered for just enough to be noticed, but never so much that she seemed to seek attention. Her social media presence was minimal, professional, polished. She had 3 children of her own and spoke of them occasionally in class. Never too much, just enough to humanize herself. She was present at every football game, clapped at every talent show, and handed out birthday cards to students even when no one else remembered. By all accounts, she was exactly who the community believed her to be. And that belief was so strong, so deeply rooted, that no one ever thought to ask how she managed to be all things to all people. No one considered how many roles she played: mother, teacher, counselor, friend, and what might happen if one of those roles began to unravel. Perfection has a cost, but no one asked her if she was paying it. They simply accepted the results and held her higher. Even the other teachers, some of whom privately resented the way she was elevated above them, kept quiet. Challenging Miss Mays meant challenging the institution itself. And besides, her students really did seem to thrive. They wrote better essays, engaged more in class, stayed after school without being told. Who would question results like that? And so, room 214 remained a sanctuary, the kind of place parents pointed to when defending public schools, the kind of place that made alumni smile with nostalgia, but also, quietly, the kind of place where things could be missed, or hidden, or ignored. Because when someone is seen as a hero, people stop looking for shadows. And in room 214, the shadows were beginning to stretch. Jake Kelly had never been the kind of student who drew much attention. He kept his head down, earned quiet B's, turned in his assignments on time, and rarely spoke unless called upon. He was observant, though, always watching, always listening. The kind of teenager who noticed patterns in conversations, remembered which teachers favored which students, and who walked the halls with an invisible map of the social ecosystem in his head. He wasn't disruptive. He wasn't rebellious. He was cautious, calculated, and it was precisely this nature that made his suspicions so difficult to shake. His younger sister, Laura, had been in Miss May's class the year before. She came home often with stories about how great her teacher was, but Jake remembered something else too. One night, Laura had said something strange. She had mentioned that Miss Mays would sometimes stand too close, that she would ask odd questions, or hold her gaze just a little too long, that she once touched her shoulder during a reading assignment and left her hand there for what felt like forever. Laura had laughed it off nervously, and their mother had told her she was probably imagining things. Jake hadn't forgotten, though. It wasn't what Laura said. It was how she said it. Her voice had tightened just slightly, like she wasn't sure she should say anything at all. And when their mother dismissed her, Laura didn't push back. She just fell silent. Jake hadn't thought much of it until he found himself sitting in room 214 that fall. At first, everything was just as people said it would be. Miss Mays was charming, engaging, warm. Her classroom was inviting. Her lectures filled with literary references and open-ended questions that made even the quietest students want to participate. She remembered everyone's name by the second day. She complimented Jake on his writing. She smiled at him every time he passed her desk. But over time, Jake began to notice things, little things, that reminded him of Laura's discomfort. There was the way Miss Mays always seemed to have a particular group of students she gave more attention to, not the loudest or the most gifted, just the ones who lingered after class, the ones who didn't speak up when she made a joke that wasn't really funny, or when her tone shifted from warm to icy with no warning. He noticed that she sometimes touched students, nothing overt, nothing that could be called inappropriate on its own, but often enough to seem deliberate. A hand on the shoulder that lingered, a palm on someone's back as she leaned in to whisper feedback. The kind of physical proximity that adults often brushed off as nurturing, but Jake saw how some students flinched, or froze, or smiled too, quickly, like they were trying to mask discomfort with politeness. He started watching her more closely, not with fear, not with certainty, but with that same calculated attention he gave to every pattern he didn't yet understand. He watched how she moved around the room, how her gaze sometimes lingered a beat too long on one student, then jumped quickly away when others entered. He noticed how the energy in the room subtly changed depending on who was sitting closest to her desk. Some students leaned forward, eager. Others shrank into their chairs. Jake realized that no one ever challenged her. Even when she gave vague instructions or graded inconsistently, the students didn't complain. If a paper came back with a C but no comments, no one asked why. If someone was called out for a late assignment but another student wasn't, no one said a word. It was like they were all walking on invisible eggshells they didn't even realize were there. Jake began to catalog these things in his head. He started writing notes on his phone, small bullet points that seemed meaningless in isolation, but together began to form a shape he couldn't ignore. Ben flinched when she touched his wrist. Ashley went silent after staying late. Same kids always volunteer to stay behind. She locked the door during 6th period again. He didn't share these notes with anyone, not yet. He wasn't sure what they meant, and he didn't want to accuse someone who had become a legend in their school without something solid. Doubt wasn't enough, but he could feel it building. At home, he found himself scrolling through old yearbooks, looking at past photos of Miss Mays with her students scanning for patterns. He watched her interviews on the local news where she spoke about community, about education, about her love for every child who walked through her door. Her tone was flawless, her words inspiring. But now, knowing what he'd seen, what he thought he'd seen, Jake couldn't help but notice something in her eyes. A flicker. Not insincerity exactly. More like calculation. Like someone playing a role with exquisite precision. It unsettled him. Not because he was sure she had done something wrong, but because of how good she was at being believed. Because of how easily the community accepted the image of her without ever questioning what lay beneath. Because even as he started to grow, convinced something was off, he still found himself second-guessing what he saw. What if he was wrong? What if he was projecting? What if this was all a misunderstanding? But then he remembered Laura. The way she had gone quiet. The way she didn't want to talk about that class anymore. The way she changed the subject when Miss Mays came up. That memory clung to him, persistent and cold. Something was wrong. He didn't know what, and he didn't know how to prove it. But he knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. Not if there was even a chance that what he was seeing wasn't just coincidence. Not if other students were feeling the same thing and didn't know how to say it. Doubt was no longer just a thought in his mind. It had become a weight, one he could carry for only so long before it demanded action. Jake didn't make the decision lightly. It wasn't a sudden act of rebellion or some teenage impulse for chaos. It was a slow, calculated shift, born from accumulating days of quiet tension, from the weight of watching something that didn't feel right unfold again and again in the corners of a room that everyone else considered safe. Doubt had transformed into conviction, but conviction alone wasn't enough. He needed proof. The kind that couldn't be argued away or softened by charm. The kind that would speak louder than a school's reputation or a teacher's legacy. So one Tuesday afternoon after school, Jake biked 10 blocks to a small electronics store tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered diner, where the aisles were crowded with outdated tech and the air smelled like old batteries and plastic. He didn't ask questions. He just bought what he came for. A small discrete camera, barely larger than a thumb drive, with a motion sensor and just enough storage to catch a few hours of footage. That night, he sat on his bed and studied it, under the glow of his desk lamp. He peeled away the stickers, adjusted the settings, and wrapped its casing in matte tape to avoid any glint under the classroom lights. He practiced tucking it inside the inner pocket of a folder, angling it so, The lens would peek out just enough if the folder were left open on a desk. He rehearsed how he'd walk into class the next day, how he'd place the folder casually on the back table, and how he'd sit 3 rows up, like always, eyes on the whiteboard, heart pounding as the seconds ticked by. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing, not his parents, not Laura, not his best friend. Some truths he had begun to understand required silence until they were ready to break themselves open. The next morning, Jake arrived to school early. He waited until the bell rang and the hallway noise swallowed everything, then slipped into room 214. Miss Mays greeted him like always, with a warm smile and a pleasant good morning that felt almost exaggerated now, like an actor leaning too hard into their lines. He nodded, said nothing, made his way to the back and placed his folder on the far left corner of the table, angled slightly toward the front of the room. The lens was on. The light was off. The camera had started recording. He took his usual seat and forced himself to breathe normally, to act like nothing had changed. But everything had. The class passed like any other. They discussed a poem, something about broken time and lost voices. Miss Mays moved through the room gracefully, as she always did, her voice smooth, her posture composed. She complimented students, laughed at their jokes, offered encouraging nods. If Jake hadn't been watching so carefully, he might have believed her again. But he noticed the way she leaned in too close to a student's ear, the way her hand lingered too long on a shoulder, the way her gaze shifted, sharp and fleeting, toward the back of the room where the folder sat. For a brief moment it felt like she knew. But then the moment passed. After class, Jake lingered just long enough for the room to empty. He retrieved the folder, tucked it under his arm, and walked calmly down the hallway, ignoring the thrum in his chest. He spent the next 2 classes pretending to take notes, but his thoughts circled like vultures over what he might find. That night, behind a locked bedroom door, he plugged the camera into his laptop and watched the playback in silence. The footage began unremarkably. Students entering the room, Miss Mays smiling at the door, light chatter as they settled into their desks. But as the minutes passed, something in the atmosphere of the video began to darken. Not in color or clarity, but in tone. Miss Mays's movements seemed more deliberate than they had lived. Her positioning in the classroom was always strategic, hovering near particular students, choosing which shoulders to touch, which names to call on in a voice just slightly different than the rest. About halfway through the period, she walked over to Ben, one of the quieter boys always kept to himself, and placed her hand on the edge of his desk. She leaned down, her face close to his, too close, said something that the camera's mic couldn't catch. Ben froze, eyes locked forward. Her fingers tapped his paper, then gently, his hand. And then she smiled and walked away as if nothing had happened. Jake paused the footage, rewound, and watched it again. And again. The gestures weren't loud, but they were unmistakably intimate. The kind of touches that went just unnoticed enough in a room full of students trying not to be noticed themselves. He kept watching. Later in the footage, Miss Mays stood at the front of the class talking about metaphor, and while her words were academic, her eyes kept drifting back to one particular student near the windows. Ashley. Ashley, who had once been outgoing and bold but who now rarely spoke in class. At one point, Miss Mays said something, and Ashley looked down at her desk, her shoulders curling inward like she wanted to disappear. Again, Jake replayed the moment. Again, the same rhythm. Power disguised as praise. Presence disguised as kindness. When the video ended, Jake sat for a long time in the dark, the laptop screen casting cold light on his face. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt sick. Because he knew now. This wasn't just suspicion. It wasn't imagination. It was real. And worse, it had probably been happening for years. Maybe not to everyone. Maybe not in the same way, but it was there. Hidden in plain sight, dressed up as nurturing, wrapped in every compliment and warm smile that had made her untouchable. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he copied the footage to a flash drive, then to a cloud account under a new name. He encrypted the folder. He wrote notes. He stared at the screen long after the video ended, trying to figure out what to do. Next, the camera had done what his voice couldn't. It had seen what others refused to see. But seeing was only the beginning. Now came the harder part, showing others. And knowing that once he did, nothing at Jefferson High, or in room 214, would ever be the same. Jake didn't rush to act. For 2 days after watching the footage, he carried it with him like a silent storm, hidden behind the lock screen of his phone, protected by passwords, duplicated across devices. He reviewed it again and again, hoping somehow that repetition would dull its weight, that maybe he had misread what he saw, that context would appear if he just stared long enough. But context never came, only clarity. What he had captured wasn't explosive in the way people expected scandal to be. There was no yelling, no violent act, no moment that screamed for justice. What he had recorded was something worse. A quiet pattern, a subtle dance of control and manipulation wrapped in gestures so familiar that no one questioned them. But now, the silence felt complicit. Now, doing nothing would be the same as accepting it. He thought about going to the school administration. That would be the logical thing, the mature thing. But he knew what would happen. They would watch it behind closed doors. They would call Miss Mays in quietly, ask her a few questions, give her time to frame her own version of the truth. And maybe they'd say it was inconclusive. Maybe they'd say it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they'd ask why Jake had been filming in the first place. The system had protected her for years, not through malice, but through comfort. She was safe. She was familiar. She was the kind of person people defended without question. And Jake was just a student, one with a camera, so he chose another path. Late Thursday night, sitting at his desk while his parents watched TV in the living room, Jake opened a private group on social media. It had been created by former students of Jefferson High, a place where alumni posted throwback photos and graduation memes and updates on college life. It had thousands of members. Some were current students, others were long gone, but many still followed the group out of habit, nostalgia, or some vague sense of connection. Jake knew that if he posted there, someone would see it. And if someone saw it, the silence would start to crack. He didn't upload the full video. That felt too invasive, too much, too soon. Instead, he clipped a 45-second section, just enough to show the pattern, just enough to make others question what they remembered. The footage showed Miss Mays walking behind a student's desk, leaning down, her hand resting briefly on his arm, then his back. Her mouth moved, quiet words just for him. He shifted uncomfortably. She smiled and walked away. The moment lingered in its ordinariness, but now, with context, it felt like something entirely different, like an invasion dressed in praise. He removed the sound. He blurred the student's face. He adjusted the contrast just slightly so that the focus remained on her movements. Then he added a caption. "You still think she's a hero?" No accusations, no hashtags. Just the video, the caption, and the silence that followed as he hovered over the post button. It took him 20 minutes to click it. He stared at the screen afterward, waiting. At first, nothing happened. A few views, no likes, no comments. Then someone reacted with a shocked emoji, then another, then a comment. "Is this recent?" Then another. "Wait, why does this feel familiar?" The responses came slowly at first, a trickle of curiosity, but within an hour the post had been shared, then shared again. Someone tagged 2 former students, then 5, then 20. Jake watched the numbers climb like a fever, views, reposts, private messages pinging into his inbox with questions he couldn't answer and confirmations he never expected. By midnight, the post had exploded beyond the alumni group. It was circulating through private chats, student discords, and even made its way to local high school confession pages. Someone uploaded it to TikTok with a new caption. "This teacher was everyone's favorite. Watch closely." It was grainy and without sound, but that only made it feel more real. Like something not meant to be seen, something caught by accident, a moment that cracked the illusion. The reactions were divided. Some people were furious. This is an invasion of privacy. You're ruining a woman's career over nothing. Others were skeptical. That could be anyone. Maybe it's taken out of context. But then, like drops of ink spreading through water, a different kind of comment began to appear. I always felt weird around her. She used to call me after school for tutoring I didn't ask for. She once made me stay late and wouldn't let me call my mom. Dozens of variations on the same theme, small discomforts that had never been voiced. And suddenly it wasn't about the video, it was about memory, about recognition. By morning, the school administration was aware. The principal sent out a vague message referencing an unauthorized video circulating online and assuring parents that an investigation was underway. But by then, it was too late to contain it. Local journalists had reached out. Anonymous sources had sent them copies of the video. A reporter from the Charleston Observer contacted Jake through a burner email he had created that morning. They wanted to verify the footage to know more. Jake didn't respond. He walked into school on Friday and felt the change like static in the air. The halls were quieter. People whispered in corners, looked over shoulders. Phones were gripped tighter. Miss Mays wasn't in her classroom. A substitute sat at the desk, expression guarded. No explanation. Just her absence, loud and sudden. Rumors flooded the cafeteria. That she had been suspended. That she had gone on medical leave. That she was suing. That she was hiding. Jake kept his head down and said nothing. But that night, when he checked the video again, it had over 200,000 views. The caption had changed. The clip had been edited, re-uploaded, paired with dramatic music. The internet had done what the institution wouldn't. It had watched, questioned, and passed judgment. It wasn't clean, it wasn't fair, but it was loud. And in the chaos, something undeniable had begun. A fracture in the story. A space where truth could finally enter. Whether it brought justice or just noise remained to be seen. But the silence was broken. And it had started with a folder, a camera, and the refusal to look away. By Monday morning, the story had outgrown the walls of Jefferson High. What had started as a shaky, silent clip buried in a private group had erupted into a statewide conversation. News vans lined up across the street from the school building before first bell, camera crews adjusting their equipment beneath the dull October sky. Students arrived with heads ducked low beneath hoodies, trying to avoid the journalists asking if they knew the teacher in the video. Parents waited in their cars longer than usual, some calling the school, some just staring at the brick facade that once symbolized safety, but now looked, somehow, smaller. The administration issued another email, longer, colder, saying Miss Mays had been placed on temporary administrative leave pending internal review. It was a line engineered to calm nerves without saying anything at all. But nerves could not be calmed. The silence she once used to control her space had turned on her, and now that it was cracking, there was no telling how far it would spread. Miss Mays didn't return to her classroom. Her car didn't appear in the staff lot. Her name was no longer called on the morning announcements for club meetings or student rehearsals. The chair behind her desk remained empty, and the cinnamon-scented diffuser that had once welcomed students into her curated sanctuary was gone. Students passed the door without glancing in. Inside, a substitute teacher sat stiffly behind the desk, grading papers in silence, while the classroom, the once vibrant room 214, felt like a stage after the play had ended, the audience gone, the lights dimmed and the curtain stuck half-drawn. The staff was divided. Some colleagues defended her. They spoke in hushed tones in the teacher's lounge about her years of service, about how dedicated she was, about how kids today don't know boundaries. Others kept their distance, unwilling to comment, faces tight with professional neutrality. A few, mostly younger teachers whispered what many had long suspected but never dared voice, that something about her presence had always felt too careful, too curated, that maybe the smile had never quite reached her eyes, that maybe they had seen things they chose to ignore. Regret surfaced in glances, not in words. Meanwhile, former students flooded social media with memories. Some defended her, writing heartfelt posts about how she helped them believe in themselves, how she stayed late to help them through breakups or grief, how she made them feel important. But others wrote different stories. Stories of detentions served alone in her classroom with no paperwork filed. Of texts from a school number that felt too personal. Of compliments that lingered just a second too long. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Not always clear, not always identical, but consistent enough to make the collective gut sink. These weren't isolated moments. This was a mosaic of silence, stitched together by people who had been too young to understand what they felt at the time, but now saw it with frightening clarity. The investigation moved fast, at least in appearances. The school district announced they were conducting interviews with past and current students. Parents demanded meetings. A few community leaders tried to tamp down the outrage by reminding everyone that no formal charges had been filed, that due process mattered, that internet justice wasn't the same as real justice, but that didn't stop the headlines. Beloved teacher under scrutiny. Hero or manipulator? Charleston's favorite educator at the center of viral storm. Her face, once printed on school banners and PTA newsletters, was now featured beside grainy screenshots and blurred red circles, frozen in frames from the video that had first set everything in motion. Jake kept his head low during all of it. He didn't speak to reporters, he didn't respond to comments, he sat in the back of his classes and watched it all unfold like a spectator to a storm he'd started. People speculated about who had posted the footage, but no one connected it to him, at least not publicly. He listened as students whispered in hallways, some outraged, others thrilled by the drama. He noticed which classmates looked shaken, which ones looked relieved. Ashley, who used to shrink every time Miss Mays called on her, now walked with her shoulders slightly straighter. Ben no longer asked to sit near the door. The air felt different now, like something invisible had been lifted from it. Outside the IE school, protests began to take shape. A small group of parents gathered one morning with signs reading, "Protect our children," and "Silence is not innocence." The following week, a different group showed up, defending her. "Due process for Mays," read one sign. "Don't cancel care," said another. The news loved it. The cameras captured the split in real time. Two versions of the same woman, battling for legitimacy. In interviews, former colleagues stumbled over words. No one wanted to say too much, but few could say nothing. Eventually, the district announced that Miss Mays had resigned. No fanfare. No final class. Just an official notice buried in an email blast at the end of a Friday. She had left the city, reportedly moved in with a sister out of state. No charges had been filed. The investigation was officially closed due to lack of conclusive evidence for criminal action. But the damage, to the institution, to the students, to her legacy, was done. Her name was removed from plaques in the auditorium. Her picture quietly taken down from the staff of the month wall. Room 214 was reassigned. The bulletin board of thank you notes was stripped bare. Life at Jefferson High resumed, but not the same. Jake didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel like a hero. What he had set in motion hadn't ended in a clear victory, just a void. The truth had been dragged into the open, yes, but it had left behind shadows, rumors, pain, a sense of collective disorientation, as though a trusted map had been ripped in half. People didn't know how to talk about what had happened, so they stopped, they moved on, or tried to, but some didn't forget. Quiet glances still passed in the hallways between those who had known something was wrong for a long time, and now finally had a name for it. And for Jake, even as the noise faded, the silence afterward felt louder than ever. Because he knew that truth doesn't always roar when it arrives. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes the fall doesn't happen in one grand collapse. Sometimes it unravels, thread by careful thread, until the whole thing slips through your hands. The school year continued. Bells rang. Students changed classes. Homework was assigned and occasionally turned in. Life resumed its shape as it always does, filling in the cracks left by things no one fully wanted to talk about. New decorations went up in the hallway outside. Room 214. The bulletin board that once bore thank you notes and senior photos curated by Miss Mays now displayed college flyers and motivational slogans printed in bold, cheerful fonts. A new teacher arrived to take over her old schedule. A woman from out of town with nervous energy and wide eyes who tried to smile too much and didn't yet know which names belonged to which silences. She asked for patience, and most students gave it to her. But they didn't forget what the room used to be. Jake continued to walk the same hallways, now with a strange weight that hadn't been there before. No one congratulated him. No one blamed him. He became a kind of quiet myth. In the background, the unnamed origin of something too disruptive to acknowledge directly. His classmates gave him space. Teachers eyed him with a mix of caution and silent respect. He never said out loud that it had been him. He didn't need to. Enough people suspected, and that suspicion functioned like a protective barrier, keeping conversations shallow and stares brief. He didn't want recognition, but he did want understanding, something deeper than gossip or viral shares. He wanted someone to say, "I saw it too." He wanted someone to admit that something had always felt wrong and they just hadn't known what to do, but no one did. At home, Laura had started speaking more openly. In quiet moments when their parents weren't around, she told him how uncomfortable she'd felt in Miss Mays's class, how she'd convinced herself it was her own fault. She described the way her teacher's praise always made her feel like she owed something in return. The way she'd freeze when asked to stay after class, unsure if she could say no, unsure even what made her uneasy in the first place. Jake listened without interruption. He realized that for every person who had spoken out online, there were probably dozens who hadn't. People like Laura. People who had buried their discomfort because there was no language for it then, because no one had believed them before there was proof. That realization stayed with him more than anything. In the weeks that followed, the outside world moved on. The media stopped covering it. The comments faded beneath newer controversies. The community, so outraged, so divided, found new topics to occupy their attention. But inside Jefferson High there was a kind of lingering shift, subtle but real. Trust wasn't as automatic as it once had been. Teachers now thought more carefully before speaking too intimately. Students hesitated longer before staying after class. There was no open discussion, no formal acknowledgement in an assembly or classroom. But something had changed in the air. It was a new kind of awareness, a quiet recalibration of what was acceptable, of what deserved a second look. Jake still carried the flash drive. He didn't watch the video anymore. He didn't need to. He had memorized every frame during those first weeks. Not the visuals, the feeling, the gut wrench of recognition, the weight of knowing something others refused to see. The moment truth stopped being abstract and became something real enough to burn. He kept the footage not out of pride, but as a safeguard, a reminder, not just of what had happened, but of what had almost stayed hidden. Some days he questioned what he had started. The fallout had been messier than he expected. There had been no confession, no courtroom justice, no clear-cut ending, just the slow erosion of a persona, the unraveling of stories once told without hesitation. Sometimes he wondered if it would have been easier not to know, not to have seen what he saw. But then he would walk past room 214 and see someone laughing, for real, not performing politeness. He would see students walk out with relaxed shoulders, not the rigid posture of people who learn to tiptoe through every interaction. And in those moments he knew it had mattered. Laura began keeping a journal. Jake noticed it one afternoon, half tucked beneath her bed. He never read it, but he saw the way her shoulders seemed less guarded lately, how she answered questions, with more confidence, how she laughed louder without apology. He never told her what he had done, but sometimes she looked at him like she knew anyway. The hardest part wasn't the fallout or the silence or the isolation. The hardest part was knowing how many others like her were still out there. People, smiling through discomfort. People swallowing instincts because someone had taught them that respect means never questioning authority. What stayed with Jake was the understanding that abuse doesn't always wear a mask of cruelty. Sometimes it looks like admiration. Sometimes it sounds like praise. Sometimes it hides inside the places we feel safest. And what stayed with the school wasn't scandal. It was uncertainty. The knowledge that for years no one had looked closely enough. That they had loved someone without asking why. That their trust had been offered too freely. No one hung new portraits in the hallway anymore. Teachers were less eager to be celebrated. Praise was quieter. And in its place came a more cautious form of honesty. Jake didn't seek credit. He didn't want thanks. He simply wanted the truth to matter more than comfort. He wanted others to learn what he had learned, that even in the safest spaces, vigilance matters, that silence has weight, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is press record.